All right, now we're in business. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Atlanta History Center. I'm Claire Haley, Vice President of Democracy Initiatives and Author Talks. It's absolutely my pleasure to welcome you all this evening to tonight's Author Talk featuring Dr. Carol Anderson. I'm in conversation with Peter Canfield. First of all, I've heard through the grapevine that traffic was atrocious tonight, so thank you all for bearing through that to come to tonight's conversation. It's a timely conversation, and it's one that I know it's good for us all to be having, so we really do appreciate you making the special effort to be here tonight. Tonight is the paperback release, first paperback release event for Dr. Anderson's book, The Second. So we're so happy to be able to host that here at Atlanta History Center. They are available tonight for purchase for 25% off. If you've not yet gotten your copy of the book, there's some for sale outside. Dr. Anderson will also be signing books after the event tonight. If you'd like to meet her and have your book signed, you're more than welcome to do that. We will also have some time tonight for your questions. I will be walking around this microphone. So when we get to that point in the program, please just wait for me to come to you with the microphone. That is because if you look in the back there, we are recording tonight's conversation, and your question will not be picked up unless if it's spoken into the microphone. So we appreciate your cooperation with that. And if you could all do me one more favor on that same note, if you take out that cell phone that's likely in your pocket or in your purse and just make sure that it is on silent or even off or on airplane mode or whatever, as long as we don't get any fun alarms or rings in the middle of the program, we'd really, really appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to briefly introduce tonight's guests, and then we will turn it over to them to begin the conversation. So again, tonight's author is Dr. Carol Anderson. She is the Charles Howard Candler Professor and Chair of African American Studies at Emory University right here in Atlanta. She is the author, of course, of The Second, as well as One Person, No Vote, which was longlisted for the National Book Award and a finalist for the Penn John Kenneth Galbraith Award. Her other books include White Rage, which was a New York Times bestseller and winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. Her other books include Bourgeois Radicals and Eyes Off the Prize. She was a contributor to the 1619 Project as well, and a Guggenheim Fellow for Constitutional Studies. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and of course, lives right here in Atlanta, Georgia. She will be in conversation tonight with Peter Canfield. Peter is a recently retired attorney, a graduate of Amherst College and Yale Law School, who lives and practiced law in Atlanta. He specialized in media and First Amendment, but also has a dearth of experience in a great deal of experience in Second Amendment issues, dating back to his defense of then New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg and a defamation lawsuit brought by Georgia gun dealer Outdoor Adventures. He has worked with the Brady Center, Everytown for Gun Safety, Giffords and Moms Against Gun Violence in connection with gun safety issues and litigation nationally, as well as in Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Texas, and Washington State. And for over 10 years, he has chaired an annual conference on Second Amendment issues for the State Bar of Georgia. So it's going to be a really informed conversation tonight. We're really looking forward to it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carol Anderson and Peter Canfield.
Thank you. Thank you.
Carol, it's nice to be here with you tonight.
It's great to be here with you, Peter. Thank you.
And it was a pleasure to read The Second, which was eye-opening in many ways for someone who has read an awful lot of court decisions about the Second. It's hard to do this without starting off by noting how many horrific gun incidents happen, it continue to happen in the country daily, and we've been saying that for years now. There was the recent shooting in Nashville that left 3 young children dead as well as 3 adults. In Kansas City, a 16-year-old honor student knocked on the wrong door by mistake, and an 84-year-old shot him in the head and then shot him again when he was down on the ground. Fortunately, he survived. Many of these shootings have happened, as we know from the past few years, at the hands of police. And it was one particular police shooting that I think set you on the course of writing this book. A police shooting in July 2016 that was actually live streamed on the internet. Could you please recall that for us and tell us about the questions it led you to ask?
Absolutely. It was the killing of Philando Castile, who was a young black man in Minnesota, and the police had pulled him over because they said that his widespread nose looked like somebody that they were looking for. And the police officer asked to see his ID. And Philando Castile, following NRA guidelines, alerts the officer that he has a license to carry weapon with him, but he is reaching for his ID as the officer had requested. The police officer just put 5 bullets into Philando Castile. And let me be real clear. He was not brandishing the weapon. He was not threatening the officer. He merely alerted the officer that he had a license to carry weapon with him. And for that, he was killed. And then folks turned to the NRA because, you know, the NRA is the staunch protector of the Second Amendment. And the NRA went virtually silent. So you've got a person killed simply for having a gun, and the NRA goes silent. And it took black members in the NRA to push the NRA to say something, which was, well, we believe that everybody, regardless of race, creed, color, religion, ought to be, you know, has the right to bear arms. And that was it. And so pundits started asking, well, do black folks have Second Amendment rights? And I went, ooh, that's a good question. Because I am a rights historian. You know, that's what I do. I study the rights of black folk. And this was one of the rights that I hadn't looked at. And so I went hunting as historians do, and started going back and looking and digging, and ended up in the 17th century.
Can I stop you there a second?
Yes.
Just to give everyone a little bit of perspective on this. You went looking for the origins of the Second Amendment after the Philando Castile murder. The U.S. Supreme Court actually made that same search, or its own search, back in 2008. And just to give everyone a perspective on that, the Second Amendment had traditionally been understood by the courts, interpreted by the courts, as an amendment that afforded what was referred to as a collective right. So to just, it's short, to read the amendment, it states, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And the courts had generally said, well, that was a collective right to keep a militia, and everybody knows that it was necessary to have a militia because they'd just gone through the war for independence and were fearful of government overreach. But there was probably less by the NRA, but by some other gun enthusiasts, there was a drumbeat of reaction against gun restrictions in the U.S. and an effort to convince the court, which then had a conservative majority, not as much as it has now, but to convince the court to finally recognize an individual right to bear arms within the Second Amendment. And this talk here caused me to go back and look at the Supreme Court found there was an individual right. It did that in 2008 in what was in the Heller, District of Columbia versus Heller case. And in that, I went back and looked at the oral argument transcript. And the court was divided 4-4, as it was on many issues, with Anthony Kennedy being the swing vote. So at oral argument, he sort of made it pretty clear that he was going to weigh in favor of this individual right to bear arms. And he said, quote, "We have reaffirmed the right to have a militia. We've established it. But in addition, there's a right to bear arms." And he said, "And in my view, there's a general right to bear arms quite without reference to the militia." And then he explained that the reason for that, he saw it, was that he'd looked back at the origins of the Second Amendment.
Mm-hmm.
And what he said is that it was clear that it arose out of the founders, and this were his words, concern for the remote settler to defend himself and his family against hostile Indian tribes and outlaws, wolves and bears and grizzlies and things like that. So Kennedy, who was a Westerner, had this very frontier view of the Second Amendment's origins, kind of what people have called a Davy Crockett view. Is that what you found when you looked?
God, no. Bad history leads to bad policy. And that is why we're fighting so hard to have history done right. In its complexity, in its expansiveness, and that we don't operate on these myth history pieces. So what I saw going through the record, as I said, I went back to the 17th century, and I started seeing these laws targeted at the enslaved, targeted at black folk, to say, "Thou shalt not bear arms." All these slave codes saying that African Americans could not have guns, they could not have ammunition. And it was because of this fear of the enslaved, this fear that they would rise up and demand their freedom, fight for their freedom, that the enslavers would in fact be killed. There was this, it kept coursing through, you kept seeing this in the correspondence going back to the king, going, "Oh my God, we just heard that there was a plot. All of us were going to get killed if we hadn't figured this out first." And then you would see another slave code come through that had even tighter and tighter restrictions, until we got to the Negro Act of 1740 coming out of South Carolina, that basically defines African Americans as, African descended are absolute slaves. And that it didn't matter, and that it was from their mother on, and that they were inherently criminal and inherently dangerous, and that you had to have structures around to keep the white community safe from these inherently violent, inherently dangerous, inherently criminal folk, because they were necessary in order to do the labor. But the white community had to be protected, and that protection meant no guns, no ammunition, no knives, no books, no writing materials. The tools of liberation, right? It was like, no. And so it was seeing this coming through over and over and over. This is what I talk about, the anti-blackness that is embedded in the Second Amendment. This fear of black people, the fear that they will do harm to the white community. So when we get to the Second Amendment itself, let me deal with some of the myths out there. So the myth of the militia, right? So we get this amber waves of grain, flag waving in the background kind of thing about the militia, these stalwart defenders, the fighters for American freedom against the British. George Washington was like, dang, what's a general got to do? Because sometimes the militia would show up, sometimes they wouldn't. Sometimes they would fight, and then sometimes in the middle of the fight, they're like, okay, peace out, I'm done. And they would take off, and the British are like, dang, what just happened here? Cool. Sometimes there was a battle in Camden where the British were coming at them, and that militia just went, you know what, I'm not feeling this. And before the first shot was fired, they took off, they walked off, right? So that was the militia. This is the militia that we get this myth about taking on the British. Not so much. And we get this notion about the militia in terms of putting down domestic tyranny, right?
Well, there were some things that militias at that time were good at,
right?
correct?
And what the militias were really good at were putting down slave revolts. That's what they were really, really good at. And so when James Madison is drafting the Constitution, because of the militia, he puts control of the militia under the feds. Well, when the ratification conventions are happening and it gets to Virginia, Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death, he's like, oh, no, son, no, son, no, son, no, son. We will not have the militia under the federal government because those feds includes folks from Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, the folks who hate slavery. We cannot trust them to send the militia in when our slaves rise up against us. We will be left defenseless. And so he and George Mason threatened to scuttle the Constitution and send the U.S. back to the unworkable days of the Articles of Confederation unless they got some protection. And so James Madison goes running to that first Congress, and he spends all of his time drafting a Bill of Rights. And so when you think about that Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the right not to be illegally searched and seized, the right to a speedy and fair trial, the right to not have cruel and unusual punishment, the right to a well-regulated militia for the security of a free state. That thing is an outlier. It is the bribe to the South, the same way that the 3/5 clause was a bribe to the South, the same way that the extension of 20 years for the Atlantic slave trade was a bribe to the South, and the same way that the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution was a bribe to the South. They made it clear they were playing some serious hardball. You know, when you were little, you used to play a game of chicken where, you know, you're driving at each other with your bicycles and whoever, right? Well, the South was playing a game of chicken, and they were willing to wreck the United States of America unless they got protection for slavery and protection for slaveholders embedded in the Constitution. When we begin to think of the Second Amendment as this amendment in the Bill of Rights to deny the rights of African Americans, then we begin to see what a toxic beast this thing is.
And you talk in the book about how during the Revolutionary War, there was, the British they recognized that slaves could potentially be their allies.
Oh yeah.
So how did that play out?
And so again, another part of the myth history that we get ignores the role of black folks in the war for independence. So one of the things is that Lord Dunsmore, he promised freedom to any enslaved African who fought for the king. Well, the colonies had basically banned black folks from fighting in the Continental Army because they just thought white men would just jump in there and be willing to fight for this nation. Well, they could never get enough white men to enlist in the Continental Army, and the British were kicking some USDA grade A prime beef butt. Just whooping them 8 ways to Sunday. And so finally they looked up and they said, you know, it's like, Lord, what are we gonna do? And somebody said, you know, you got a whole slew of black folk who are running over to the British. You got another whole slew that if you promise them their freedom, they will fight for the United States. And so you started seeing these northern colonies saying, okay, you fight for us, you get your freedom. That Continental Army was a fully integrated army. So when we think about the Jim Crowed armies, the racially segregated armies, that initial army that fought for freedom was an integrated army. So then as the British, so the war is just, all of a sudden it's stiffened up, and the British went like, ooh, this wasn't as easy as we thought it was going to be. Oh, I know, let's head south to the soft underbelly. And so they head south, they take Savannah, just boom, like that. Then they're headed to Charleston. And Washington looks up and he's like, oh crap. And so that's the scholarly term. and so he sends his emissary, John Lawrence, down there to say, you know what you got to do? You've got to arm the enslaved. That's the British are coming in with 8,000 troops. You only have 750 white men, because they had put the rest of their white men in the militia to control that enslaved population. So there were only available 750 white men to fend off 8,000 British troops. The South Carolina government looked at him and said, you want us to do what? And they said, arm the enslaved. They said, we'll take our chances with the British. We would rather take our chances with a king who is seeing us as a traitor than put weapons in the hands of the enslaved. Yeah, think about that. They were willing to scuttle the United States of America. So this is that history. So what the Supreme Court was looking at, Lord, I don't know.
Right. Well, and I think that, you know, speaking for myself and many of us who grew up getting American history that was, and not just you know, high school grade American history, mm-hmm. but there's mm-hmm. been a tendency when you go back and look at, you know, like the Constitutional Convention, slavery doesn't get, it almost seems like, you know, blacks were property, and yes, that was every, you know, people had different views about that, but it didn't really inform the development of the Constitution. But as you talk about in the book, both like the 3/5 clause, mm-hmm. the Second Amendment was very important. So after the Revolution, after the Constitution, mm-hmm. You know, and a number of blacks were freed as a result of service, I assume, mm-hmm. in the Continental Army. Mm-hmm. How did Congress respond?
Sister right over there just started shaking her head no. How did Congress respond? So there was Ben Franklin brought in a petition from the Quakers in Pennsylvania to provide a pathway for Congress to be able to dismantle slavery. Whoo. The Southern representatives went ballistic, lost their ever-loving last minds, started threatening to beat up folk. You will be in mortal danger, they said, if you pull a stunt like that. And James Madison, seeing this nation that he had just worked so hard to stitch together, getting ready to fall apart once again on the question of slavery, worked behind the scenes to come up with a proclamation that basically says Congress does not have the power to do that. Then the next bill that came through was the 1790 Naturalization Act. And what that did was to define who could be an American citizen, who was an immigrant. After they went through a lot of rigmarole about it, what they basically came up with is that you had to be white. So you're seeing the idea of American being infused with whiteness. That is who an American is. Then the next bill was the 1792 Uniform Militia Act. And that Uniform Militia Act said that every able-bodied white male between the ages of 18 and 45 must join the militia and must have a gun. And so you're seeing in federal law the definition of American as being white. You're seeing the definition of protecting America as being white male, and that white male citizenship is attached to a gun.
And one of the events that you talk about that helped further fuel that kind of reaction was what happened in Haiti.
Oh, Lord.
Which was 1791, I think, right between those two.
Yes, and I tell you, it was fascinating going through the correspondence of the founding fathers looking at the Haitian Revolution. Because what you saw was pure, unmitigated fear. Fear that the ideas of liberty, equality, and freedom and democracy had now jumped out of this nice bounded whiteness, that black people believed that they could be free, that black people believed that they had the access to justice and liberty and equality, and my God, were willing to fight for it. Because the Spanish came to try to stop it, and the Haitians beat the Spanish. Then the British came, the British, and the Haitians beat the British. And so then Napoleon sent a huge force to take over that island again. And Toussaint Louverture was like, I'm gonna tell you what, we're getting ready to do a scorched earth policy here. Nothing that we have worked for shall feed that army, nothing. And we're gonna hold them off long enough so then when the rains would come, boom, yellow fever will take them out. And that strategy worked. And so when you have this island of black folk who have defeated 3 major European powers, the fear was like, not only do you have an example of what an enslaved society can do when they've got that idea of freedom in their head.
Well, and you quote correspondence between a number of the founders regarding Haiti, and Thomas Jefferson made the statement, quote, he could see himself as the target of a justifiable revolution by his own slaves.
Yes. I mean, this is giving you a sense of, and it was like, those ideas were not meant for them. And when they have these ideas, and if they get their hands on weapons, what happened in Haiti, what they call Saint-Domingue, can happen to us. We've got to stop this. And so you see places like Baltimore, because when the slaveholders were fleeing from Haiti and they were bringing their enslaved with them, like one of the places they stopped was Baltimore. And Baltimore went, oh my God, that Saint-Domingue fever is going to be here. So they then opened up the public armory to all whites so that they could have the weapons that they needed in order to fend off this idea that black people could be free.
So I'm fast forwarding a little bit now, but the Civil War happens.
Yes.
Did it change things for blacks and guns?
No. And that was one of the revelations that I had in doing this work, like I said, starting in the 17th century and going all the way up through the 21st, was that the legal status of African Americans did not change their relationship to the Second Amendment. So whether enslaved, whether free blacks, whether denizen, which was that netherland between enslaved and citizen, whether emancipated, and whether now as a birthright citizen, whether Jim Crowed, whether civil rights, whether post-Obama, the same relationship of black folks to guns came through there. So what I saw after the Civil War was that Andrew Johnson, who is probably one of the worst presidents ever, basically reinstalled the Confederacy. And they started passing things called the Black Codes. And the Black Codes not only dealt with the control of black labor, so that African Americans had to sign a labor contract, that annual labor contract, that forbid them from going to another employer who could pay better. I mean, you imagine your employer where you've got a sign that you can't leave. Kind of sounds like, I don't know, slavery. And that if you did, you could be auctioned off. But a key component in the Black Codes was also disarmament of the black population, because with the Civil War, there were arms, right? With war, you've got guns. And so black folks had guns. And so you get these white domestic terrorists, like the Ku Klux Klan, like the White Camellia, like the Red Shirts, who are going in and just terrorizing the black community to disarm them and put them back in their place.
And the courts weren't of much help. I mean, you talk about the Cruikshank decision.
That one guts me. The Cruikshank decision. So you had the radical Republicans, and I love that term, right? The radical Republicans in Congress, crafting the legal architecture for citizenship for the freed people. So the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the Enforcement Acts, and the Force Acts. The Enforcement Acts dealt with the white domestic terrorism that was wreaking havoc, and these states weren't going to do jack doggone diddly to stop it. Again, another scholarly term. And so the federal government was going to have the power to step in between these white domestic terrorists and the black community and these African American citizens. Well, in Colfax, Louisiana, a black militia got slaughtered for trying to defend the results of an election. Slaughtered. And Louisiana looked up and was like, oh yeah, it be that way sometimes. And so the feds stepped in and charged these folks, the leadership, with violating the Enforcement Acts. That case gets all the way up to the US Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that the Enforcement Act does not apply to private actors, only to state actors. And so the violence that the Ku Klux Klan was raining down on folk, well, that was up to the state to stop it.
Even though, as you point out, the Ku Klux Klan force that did that was led by the sheriff of the county.
Yes, I mean, so you've got state actors in this group doing this, and I mean, it was torture, folks were surrendering and they were shooting them. I mean, it was violating. It was just horrific. And they were proud of what they had done. And so when the feds stepped in and said, no, you can't do that. That's not how we roll. And the Supreme Court said, oh, yes, it is. And so imagine what that does then is it's saying that African Americans have as much right as the state is willing to grant. And President Ulysses S. Grant, because there was the Colfax Massacre and then there was the Hamburg Massacre shortly thereafter with the same result. And he said, you know, what these states have in common is not Christianity. It is not civilization. It is the right to kill Negroes without any consequence. I mean, and he was beside himself, heartsick.
So it's not surprising that given decisions like that, even though they didn't have an enforceable right to have guns, many blacks nevertheless were armed for self-defense purposes.
Absolutely.
And I mean, let me ask you to talk about two incidents you tell in the book. First, what happened here in Atlanta in 1906 in that regard, and then to bring it forward to the 1960s and California.
And so one of the things is to understand that as I looked back into the 17th century, what I saw was that African Americans did not have the right to self-defense. So written into the slave codes was that whether you were enslaved or a free black, you could not defend yourself against somebody white. So that's foundational. So in Atlanta in 1906, you had two things happening. You had a hotly contested gubernatorial race between Clark Howell and Hoke Smith, both of them racist of the first magnitude, and running on a platform of how do we disfranchise this black population. You know, so the argument wasn't whether to disfranchise, it was how deeply, how deep and how hard do we go? And then you had a series of newspapers competing for sales, right? And they began inflaming the public with tales of black men raping white women. And I mean, and it was just vile Negro rapist beast, you know, big headlines, you know, you could just, and it just, and you know, you could read about the ripping bodices. I mean, it was just so, and it was one right after the other. And at one point you had a white man standing there going, we're here, we've got to protect our women. Are we going to sit here and take this? And then the hunt for black folk began. And they just pulling black folks off of streetcars, where they were working, beating them in the street. There were descriptions of brains splattered on the walls. And the cops were like, well, you know, we can't protect you. There's nothing we can do. But what the cops were trying to do was to disarm the black community. That was like, oh no, we're not going down like this. And so there was an area of hardworking black folk called Darktown. And Darktown was like, bring it. And so the mob is getting ready to attack, and you heard and boom, and the mob went, damn, did they just shoot at us? And black folk were like, yeah. And so the mob came again, and the mob backed up, went, damn. And so then the mob was like, okay, we know, because these are the folk who are like doing the hard work. We're going to go over to Brownsville, which is where the professors and the doctors, the black doctors and the black attorneys live. And so they had their guns too. So there is a car that drives through, and the folk in Brownsville thought that they were getting ready to be attacked, so they shot. Turned out to be cops. The governor called in the militia, and they hit Brownsville with everything they had. Just went through that community, went through their homes like stormtroopers. Beating, disarming, just because they were defending themselves from a mob that the police refused to defend the black community from. We get too many of these stories. There are several of these in the book. And because what I'm really laying out is that right to self-defense is not readily available to black folk. When we get into the 1960s, because now we're getting through the civil rights movement, right? And I'm getting ready to move us to California, because this just isn't a Southern story. This is an American story. And in California, the cops were beating up on black folk left and right. The police brutality was just, and there was no entity. The legislature looked and went, eh. The mayor's office, eh. City councils, eh. And so a group, the Black Panthers, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, said, okay, we're getting ready to protect our community. And so they knew California's gun laws. And they decided to police the police. So when the police would roll up on somebody and try to arrest them, the Panthers would jump out with their guns. They knew how far away they had to stay from the police officers. They knew what kinds of guns they could carry and what kinds they couldn't. They knew what kind of ammunition they had to have. They knew how to not point their guns.
It was like Georgia now, an open carry state. You could
Yes.
carry guns wherever.
Yes, yes. And the cops did not like this. Let me say this again. The cops did not like this because these were black men who would not back down. Black men and women who would not back down. And so they would try to pull over the Panthers and arrest them for something, but they're like, dang, they're not doing anything illegal. And the Panthers are like, yeah. So then the cops ran to Don Mulford, who was a conservative legislator in the California Assembly, and said, we got to do something about these Panthers. They're carrying these guns. And so Mulford got the NRA, yes, the NRA, to help him write gun control legislation to make what the Panthers were doing illegal. Yeah.
So they,
Yeah. So the Mulford Act gets passed with the help of the NRA. And Ronald Reagan was like, I am eagerly awaiting this legislation. I will sign it the moment it hits my desk. Right? So this thing about who has the right to bear arms, who has the right to self-defense. We keep seeing it course through American history from the 17th century. We're now into the 20th.
In the paperback, and I know time may be running short to leave time for questions. You write an afterword to the book that talks about a number of things, including January 6th, but it also notes the fact that the Supreme Court just this past summer had another one of their first gun cases since Heller and McDonald, in which the Supreme Court had pretty much kept hands off local gun efforts to regulate guns at the state and local level. But they took this case from New York City, which had a law which was very restrictive in terms of carry. And the conservative court did what you would expect it to do and said that didn't pass muster under the Second Amendment. So for the first time, they said the right to bear arms is not just for self-defense in your home, but you actually have a constitutional right to carry outside of your home. But what I want to ask you about, there was a brief filed in that case by a number of black public defenders that really that was filed on the side of those who challenged the New York statute. And the brief made the case. They said this has been so disproportionately enforced, and noted that I think in 2020, 96% of the arrests made for gun possession in New York City under this law were of blacks or Latinos. So they filed this brief in support of the challenge. What is that?
And yeah, and so one of the things, I read that brief, and it was a powerful brief, because one of the things that we know is that the criminal justice system disparately goes after brown folk and black folk. We know this. But what that brief didn't deal with, because it couldn't, was the underlying anti-blackness, the underlying sense that black is criminal, black people are dangerous, black people are inherently violent. And until we deal with that in this society, we're going to continue to see this kind of mess. And so one of the Supreme Courts, I think it was the decision itself, or one of the what do you call it?
Concurring.
That's
Yeah.
it. Whew. One of the concurring pieces just crafted this dystopian view. You know, you're walking down the streets in New York City. You're not safe. At any moment, you could be raped, you could be mugged, you could be killed. The police can't be there all the time to protect all 20 million people. All that stands between you and your safety on the dangerous streets of New York City is your gun. And I went, Lord have mercy. I am reading a combination of Escape from New York. You remember that movie? And Charles Bronson's Death Wish. You know, and so when you see that coming in a Supreme Court decision, it tells you how urban black crime becomes so embedded in the operating code that Ralph Yarl, the 16-year-old boy in Kansas City, and so you have, I forget the man's name, the 84-year-old man who shot him, saying, well, I was afraid. I saw this big black guy. Ralph Yarl is 140 pounds and 5'8". But that language of big black scary guy is the language we heard with Trayvon Martin as they thugified him. It is the language that we heard with Tamir Rice, which turns a 12-year-old boy into a 20-year-old man. It is the language we heard with Michael Brown. It is the language we heard with Eric Garner. So that scary big black guy is embedded in the code. And it's part of the work we have to do in this society. Because part of what I'm arguing in this book is that because of the intense anti-blackness in this society, we have made a deal, a Faustian bargain, that we are willing to have 400 million guns in the United States, more guns than people. And we are willing to be unsafe in our schools, unsafe in our grocery stores, unsafe in our churches, unsafe in our amusement parks, in order to stave off the threat of the scary black person. There's a wonderful book by Jonathan Metzl called Dying of Whiteness. And one of the things he does is he goes into rural Missouri, and he's meeting in a support group with families that have had gun violence in their family. And one of the things that comes up are gun safety laws. And this is white rural Missouri. Let me be real clear here, white rural Missouri. And they're like, absolutely not. Because those people from St. Louis will come down here and try to take everything that we have. And the only thing that's stopping them is our guns. And when you begin to think about that Black Lives Matter protest that happened in St. Louis, where the McCluskeys come out in their Izods and with their guns, pointed at a group of peaceful protesters, and they are elevated, heralded. It's telling you something that is operating in this nation's code. And we will continue to be unsafe wherever we are. I think, I start the afterword with the slaughter in Buffalo. Where he is articulating the great replacement theory. And so he has to kill these black people in order to save and keep the white community safe. And so he does his intel work, figuring out where is the largest black community. Okay, then he was going to hit a school, but he was like, nah, not a school. Going to the sole grocery store in the black community. You know how we deal with food deserts. So the sole grocery store, and then figuring out when was the time when most black folk would be in there. He timed it to do maximum damage. That's what we're dealing with, and that's what we have to fight.
Will you take a question?
I would
or
love
two?
questions, yes.
Go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question for our speakers. Yep. Start up there. I'll come back here.
Try this. I may not be able to pull it off. So the underlying sense that black people are dangerous, the dystopian view, you're not safe, and that all that keeps you safe is your gun. I can tell you almost everybody here would like more restrictive gun laws, even anti-gun. You've got a lot of progressive white people, white women in here. And yet, I grew up in this area. So I know how I was raised, which is to be fearful, to see black people as dangerous and inferior. And anybody who says they weren't raised that way grew up somewhere different than when I did, and I grew up here. So I'm curious, what do you want, what could we be saying, which is not only am I for these a different sense of gun laws and restrictions, but because I know, as a white progressive woman, that what the danger is, that I'm not addressing that I could. There's a connection with who I am and how I was raised, where it's easy to be progressive and anti-gun in some different ways, but to not recognize the fullness of the anti-blackness. And I just wonder what you have to say to that.
And that's why I wrote the book, because the discussion about guns has been whether it was about the individual right to bear arms or whether this was about a well-regulated militia. And I'm like, that's not the point. The point is the anti-blackness that is underneath this. The point is the way that gun ownership, the way that citizenship is wrapped in this Second Amendment. And so it is defining this citizenship as anti-blackness. When we begin to have that discussion, then we are moving into the areas where we're talking about what real history looks like. It's not that 1776 history that Trump tried to stuff down our throats. It's not the patriotic history or the I only want to have Western civilization taught in Ron DeSantis's narrow view of what Western civilization is. It means that we fight against the constrictions on our knowledge. It means that we fight against the kind of flattened, heroic, sanitized American history. Because when we have the knowledge, I really believe that part of what happened with the killing of George Floyd was the kind of shock that you could have a cop putting his knee on a man's neck for 9 minutes, knowing he's being filmed and not flinching, being like really cool with it. Like, yeah, I'm doing this thing, yeah. I mean, that kind of nonchalantness, if that's even a word, right. in committing that murder. Knowing that sense of impunity. And it stunned this nation. In many ways, the same way that the cataclysm on Bloody Sunday on the Edmund Pettus Bridge stunned this nation. And so you see this mass 50-state movement where people were like, justice, justice. So do you remember in DC where the Black Lives Matter protest was happening, and there was a young black man who was kneeling, and the cops are coming at him, and a young white woman jumps in between and gets between the cops and that young black man. And I heard the danger, Will Robinson, because the architecture of white privilege was just crumbling right there, because she understood that she had privilege in order to stop the cops from doing to that black man what they wanted to do. And you could hear how did she learn that? We gotta stop that. We can't have these kids believing that black folks are human. We can't have them using their privilege in order to fight for a much more humane world. And so begin to think about when you started seeing the book bans, when you started seeing the battles at the school board meetings, when you began to see the banning of ethnic studies curriculum. So this fight is a much larger fight, and we need folks to engage in this larger fight, because this larger fight is about humanity. It is about justice. It is about dignity. It is about democracy. Yeah.
Do you think Haiti is still being punished today for daring to be independent?
Lord have mercy. Woo. So, I was at a conference and folks were talking about Haiti. And one of the things that came up was how Haiti had to pay reparations to France. But you hear, the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. Haiti has been purposely bankrupted, has been purposely stripped of its resources and its autonomy. Yes.
This was a great talk, thank you.
Thank you.
So my question is really a comment question. So future historians can use your book because you've done all the hard work, but do you think there'll be a time when you don't have to have special books that in our high schools and our elementary schools and college, the true American history will be taught to everyone?
I feel like Dorothy somewhere over the rainbow.
Yeah.
But that is what we're fighting now. That is, seeing do you remember during the summer of the George Floyd protest, the New York Times bestsellers all dealt with issues of race and racism, because this was a nation hungry to figure out, how did this happen? What is this? How did we get here? How do we get out of this space? And I wrote a book called White Rage. And what I argue in that is that whenever you have these moments of significant advancement for African Americans, there is a massive policy backlash to undermine that advancement. So we saw it after Reconstruction with the Supreme Court. We saw it, and I don't mean to scrunch up my face when I say Supreme Court. And we saw it after the Brown decision. Lord, we saw it after, and we saw it after. And I think that one of the things that we saw after the George Floyd protest was another wave of white rage, where you started seeing this attack on education. You started seeing this attack on this knowledge base.
And just to be clear, by white rage, you're not talking about, like working class people who are out getting mad in their basements. You're talking about people who have the power to actually.
Right, I'm talking about the Supreme Court. I'm talking about governors. I'm talking about mayors. I'm talking about public policy folk. So when you're seeing a Ron DeSantis, when Yeah, you know, it's like one of those things where all you got to say is like you just have to say George Wallace, right? When you're seeing people in positions of power wielding that power to undermine democracy, to undermine the humanity of the folks who live here, that's white rage. And folks were like, how are you calling this rage? You know, because one of the things that there are these deflective moments in our society. So we like to think that racism is just a Southern thing. Just go to Boston. Whew. We like to think that that this kind of virulent racism is from folks who are uneducated, who live in the hills. And that's part of the work that we have to do, is understanding how we got here, is understanding how, when we're making these incredible movements for a more inclusive democracy, what I call a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual, vibrant democracy, whew, there's always this pushback. And we have to be ready for the pushback, because we've got to keep pushing forward. We don't have to live in fear.
Hi, I have a two-part question having to do with stand your ground laws. The first part has to do with the sort of a general question. Do you think the stand your ground laws have changed the culture about the use of deadly force, in the sense that it may have eroded some of the inhibitions that people might have had in the past about pulling a gun and shooting somebody over something relatively trivial? That's the first part. And the second part has to do with, gets back to Cruikshank decision that you alluded to a little bit earlier. I've noticed that a lot of prosecutors use the stand your ground laws as an excuse or a justification for not prosecuting whites who shoot blacks, whereas the reverse, it provides no restraints on the use of the stand your ground laws.
And your book really talks about that.
Yeah, so one of the things is that with stand your ground expands what's the castle doctrine. The castle doctrine is like, if somebody comes into your house that's not supposed to be there, you have the right to defend your castle. What stand your ground says is that anywhere where you have a right to be and you perceive a threat, you do not have to retreat, you can shoot. Now, that sister's look again, it's just priceless. I wish y'all could see this. And the thing is that there is a scholar out of Stanford, Professor Jennifer Eberhardt, who has done a series of studies on this. And what she has found is how black folks are the default threat. So she did a study where she cued the participants with a black face, somebody black, and then had fuzzy images of things, and they had to buzz in when they knew what that fuzzy image was. Whenever she cued with a black face, boom, they could immediately see a gun. They could immediately see a knife. They could immediately see danger. When she cued with a white face, it was like, what is that? A balloon? I don't know. So when you have a law, and that the first real boom of that law came out of Florida, and it was being written by Marion Hammer, I believe is her name, who was a big powerhouse in the NRA. Yeah. And so when you have perceive a threat, and so this is why you have, when whites kill somebody black and you stand your ground, they are 10 times more likely to walk under justifiable homicide than when somebody black kills somebody white under stand your ground. And I think that part of what it has done is it really has removed the kind of psychological block, because if you're like, I perceive a threat, I'm in danger. Think about Michael Dunn, who is the guy in Florida who killed Lucy McBath's son. And he hollered, "Stand your ground," and thought he could get away with it. The thing that did him in was that the car was moving away from him when he was shooting. They were retreating. And then he and his girlfriend went and ordered pizza, and like nothing had happened. And so it was the circumstances around it that made it so egregious. But he believed that he could do it. He was hollering, "Stand your ground." Yeah.
We're going to do 3 more. I have one here. I've not gotten to that side of the room as much, so if there's 2 over there, I'll come. One there and someone in the back.
Hi, Dr. Anderson. Regarding the issue of fear, now, my assessment is that I should be afraid, and people of color should be afraid of white people. When we look at many of the instances you've brought up tonight, obviously slavery, the wiping out of indigenous people in this country, proves that white people have killed more black and indigenous people than we could ever touch. And they have destroyed many people, more people than we could ever touch. So when they talk about being afraid, isn't it really, well, my perspective is that it's really a matter of they're afraid that we are going to do to them what they have done and continue to do to us. Not that they're afraid that we might rob their houses, but that they're afraid that we are going to try and kill them, mass murder, oppress them in the ways that they've done to us. And that's really why they want the guns, and that's really why they're trying to destroy us in any way possible.
The issue of retribution was spoken early in the colonial period. That was also one of the underlying themes coursing through this, is that they're going to do to us, if they ever get the chance, what we did to them. And it reminds me of a study that was done in apartheid South Africa in the 1970s. And the question was, so they asked whites, South African whites, about apartheid, and they said, "Look, we know it's evil. We know this thing is fundamentally wrong. But if we get rid of apartheid, they're going to do to us what we did to them." And so what isn't understood is that when black folks talk about freedom, it's just to be free. It is just to be able to live in our full humanity. It is to be able to be as regular and as superb or as trifling as we can be. It's not about retribution. It is about being free, being human. And that seems to be a narrative that gets destroyed under the great replacement theory. So when you have that guy just soaking up that crap is my other scholarly term, from Tucker Carlson. Yeah. It is the fear that, okay, so let me come at this another way. One of the things that I find fascinating is the sense about minorities. So if you listen to like the anti-affirmative action discussions on minorities, is that they get everything. They're given the best slots at Harvard. They're given the best jobs. They're given these great positions. They are given. I'm like, if that's the case, everybody should want to be a minority. So why are you afraid of being a minority if everything is just given to you and you don't have to work for it? So it begins to tell you that the narratives that are there are just like fig leaves to cover something that's much deeper. And we have to deal with that depth. And that's why I love Jane Elliott's work out of Iowa, Blue Eye. Yeah, because she's getting in there and doing that work of dismantling those notions, those ethnic notions, that racism that's in there. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. I had a question for, you make mention of these very high-powered people, politicians, and they're not put up there just on their own. There's a whole electorate, a whole public, many number of citizens who are actually casting a vote. Mm-hmm. And that's what's more fearful for me. Because I'm going to interact with those, but I won't interact with DeSantis. I won't be interacting with, because I'm not going to ever meet them. Mm-hmm. But the other people who actually cast a vote and are listening and soaking it up and wanting them to do their mission are the people that we're going to be interacting with, that we have to educate and change. And I'm just wondering, how do you keep going with all of this shit?
That's the scholarly term.
I mean, seriously, how does someone like you, who is like, look at this, look at what the truth is, how come no one is believing it, hearing it, and how do you keep going? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I stand on the shoulders of some powerful ancestors. And part of what I say is, my people survived the Middle Passage. What you got? And I also know that it is in this struggle. So let me tell you a quick story. My great-great-grandfather, I think it was enslaved in Tennessee. And he fell in love with the woman next door. He loved her some him. He loved him some her, yeah. And he refused to work until he could marry her. Now imagine having that kind of like, what's my name, to your master who can kill you unless you are allowed to live into your full humanity. And so his master was like, dang, what'd you just say? He's like, I'm not doing any work until I can be with her. And so his master bought her. They married, and then my great-great-grandfather did that side job that some enslaved people were able to do, and he bought her freedom. And then he bought his. And then they got the hell out of Tennessee. That kind of strength, that kind of imagining what freedom could be, when everything around you tells you you can't have it, that's what I pull on. And I pull on the vision that this nation can be so much better, can be stronger, can just be less. I'm talking about swag, real swag, not that fake bravado crap, but real swag. We could do that. That's my vision. And then I have these amazing students who just, wow, just show up every day handling business with this vision of what could be and putting in the work to make this nation and this world stronger and more humane. That's what it is.
We have one last question tonight. I just want to apologize to all of the raised hands we weren't able to get to, but Dr. Anderson will be signing books, and we can chit-chat in the signing line too.
Thank you for allowing me to ask this question. Dr. Anderson, quick question. Where does your research situate within the conversation discussion for reparations?
I am on a grant right now. It's a grant, a huge grant, and that grant is dealing with reparations. Our team are interviewing folks in Atlanta, in the Black Atlanta community, to hear their stories about what was lost and why, and then pulling together a plan, a white paper, a policy paper, to begin to make that argument. Yeah. And yesterday I was giving a talk on economic equity. And I just started documenting the losses. In Ocoee, Florida, an ethnic cleansing that wiped out black folk out of there, and $10 million worth of black property just gone. Black Wall Street in Tulsa, $200 million gone. Just over and over and over. Because as a scholar, it is that documentation that to me becomes foundational for interjecting in this argument. Yeah, I'm there. I'm there.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Carol Anderson and Peter Canfield.
Thank you, Peter. That was wonderful. Peter.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you to all of you for spending your Wednesday evening with us here at
Yes.
Atlanta History Center. We will meet you outside at the signing line. There are more copies of the second available for purchase, and we hope to see you back here again soon. Thank you.
Wonderful.